Urinary system. That's what we're going to talk about today, the urinary system. Does more than just get rid of liquid waste. Okay. It regulates plasma ion concentrations. So by between what it gets rid of, okay, depending on what it gets rid of, helps you regulate your ion concentrations. Okay, it regulates blood volume and blood pressure. Okay, by releasing renin, angiotensin, things like that. Helps you stabilize the blood pH by hydrogen ion concentration. Prevents the loss of valuable nutrients by letting them not filter out. Eliminates organic matter that you don't need in the body. Synthesizes calcitrol. Calcitrol is vitamin D. Prevents dehydration. It reabsorbs water back into your system. And it aids the liver with some of its functions also. Okay. The urinary system is your kidneys and all the nephrons that are associated with the kidneys. These are your filtration units right here. You have your ureters, your urinary bladder, and your urethra. So from the kidneys, the liquid flows through ureters to the urinary bladder flows down the urethra to the outside of the body. Okay, so components of the urinary system. Kidneys produce urine. Okay, they take that and they transport it through the ureters to the urinary bladder. Okay, that's what your ureter does. That's your transportation tubes from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. Urinary bladder stores urine prior to elimination. Then the urinary bladder feeds into the urethra, which conducts the urine to the external portion of the body. And in males, it transports semen as well. So you have your kidneys. Above each kidney, you have what's called a suprarenal gland or an adrenal gland. Okay, you have renal arteries and veins feeding into the kidneys through your hilum. And then you see the aorta and the inferior vena cava running down the center. So the right kidney, okay, it's covered by the liver, the hepatic flexure of the large intestine, and the duodenum. The left kidney is covered by your spleen, your stomach, the pancreas, the splenic flexure or your left flexure, and your jejunum. That's what covers over it when you do the dissections. The left kidney is positioned higher than the right kidney. Okay, both kidneys have a suprarenal gland or an adrenal gland, the same thing. Okay, on top of each kidney. Okay, we did that here. You have the kidney, adrenal gland. You can see on top of each one. Kidney goes to your ureter, urinary bladder, to the urethra. There's 3 layers of connective tissue that protect the kidneys. There's a fibrous capsule, there's a perinephric fat, and there's renal fascia. Okay, this is your kidney, and you can see the different layers. Okay, here's your fibrous capsule. This capsule surrounds each around the kidney here. The perinephric fat is a fat pad around it, and the renal fascia is a connective tissue that flows around that outside edge of it. Okay. Those are 3 layers that protect the kidney. The fibrous capsule, which is closest to the organ, the perinephric fat pad, and then the renal fascia, which flows around it, like the greater omentum that flows around and protects everything there. Okay. A typical kidney is about 10 centimeters long, 5.5 centimeters wide, 3 centimeters thick, and weighs about 150 grams. Okay. The medial indentation is the hilum. The hilum is an indentation where the arteries, veins, nerves, and lymphatic systems all enter and leave from the kidney. It's called the hilum. So renal arteries enter at the hilum, renal veins and the ureters exit at the hilum. Okay. So your afferent and your efferent sections enter and exit at the hilum of the kidney. Okay, so here's the kidneys. This is your right, this is your left. Okay, you can see the diaphragm above everything here. You can see the aorta coming down through. Once it passes the diaphragm, it's the abdominal aorta. You can see the inferior vena cava, going back up. And you have your right suprarenal gland and your right kidney. And you can see here, where the arteries and veins are entering, this is the hilum, which is your indentation. And so your arteries, veins, and your ureter exits from the kidneys at the hilum. All right, so cross-section of the kidney. Look at a cross-section. You have a cortex and you have medulla. The cortex is the outer layer. Medulla is the inner layer. The medulla has your renal lobes, which are individual sections of the kidney that are divided off. You have your renal pyramids, renal papillae, and your renal columns. I'll show you exactly what all those are. The renal pelvis, okay, is the area where the urine's dumped into. You have your minor calyx, your major calyx, and then you have your renal pelvis. It's kind of contingent with that, where the urine gets put into, and then it goes into your ureter. Okay, so here's your renal pelvis. This is this area. This is the minor calyx, which is the smaller tubes. This is the major calyx, which is your bigger tubes. And it feeds into the renal pelvis, and it goes into the ureter. Okay, this is all at the hilum. Okay, so on the section here, you see the cortex, and you see the medulla, your inner and outer layer. You see your hilum, which is your indentation, your arteries, veins, and your ureters run into. Okay, you have a minor calyx, feeds into the major calyx, feeds into the renal pelvis, feeds into the ureter. That's how urine flows. Okay, so here we go. Here's your minor calyx, your small tubes, your major calyx, which is your larger tubes, feeding into the renal pelvis, which is the collecting area, and that feeds into the ureter, and this flows into the urinary bladder. Okay, so the blood supply to the kidney. Okay, beginning with blood in the renal arteries, blood flows to what's called the segmental arteries. Okay, then it goes to the interlobar arteries, arcuate arteries, cortical radiate arteries, afferent arterioles, and then the glomerular capillaries. So each of those gets smaller and smaller and smaller, so it can filter out the blood into the different areas. Okay, afferent arterioles means what? Afferent means coming in or going out. Just like a nervous system.
Going out.
Other one.
Going
Afferent's
in.
coming in, efferent's going out. Okay, so your afferent arteries are going in, just like a nervous system. Afferent comes in, efferent goes out. Then waste is dropped into the nephrons, and then we have a filtration that takes place. Okay, so coming in, here is your renal artery. Okay, and then you got your suprarenal artery branching off that. Then this branches into your segmental artery. Okay, branches into the interlobular arteries, connecting all those different lobes, goes between them. And then it goes to the cortical radiate arteries, which branch out very small and radiate all over the cortex. Okay, and you have your arcuate arteries, which are your ones that spin around the edges, feeding off the cortic radiate arteries. Okay, so you have the renal artery, you have your segmental arteries, your interlobular arteries, your arcuate arteries, and then your corticate radiate arteries. Okay, each one gets smaller and smaller, providing blood flow into the kidneys. Okay, so here's your arcuate arteries. You can see branching off each pyramid here, coming across. Okay, and it branches into the cortical radiate arteries. These cortical radiate arteries feeds into the glomerulus. Okay, you have your afferent arterioles, which is very small, and each of these glomeruli are filtration units. Okay, and we'll show you how those work in just a second as those come up. Okay, so the blood supply. So after waste is dropped off of the nephrons, okay, blood leaves the kidney, like going back the exact opposite direction. Okay, it goes back towards the heart. You have your glomerular capillaries. Okay, then you got your efferent arterioles. Efferent means going out. The peritubular capillaries, or vacuorescence capillaries, the interlobular veins, arcuate veins, interlobular veins. Okay, renal vein into the inferior vena cava. And the inferior vena cava feeds into the right atrium, back into the heart, be pumped out again. So these are your interlobular veins, interlobar veins, arcuate veins, and feeds into the renal vein, which feeds into your inferior vena cava. That's your blood supply. Innervation in the kidneys. Urine production is regulated by autoregulation. It involves reflex changes in the diameter of the nephron arterioles. So the shape of it determines how much blood flows into the filtration unit, the glomerular filtrate, okay, into the glomerulus. It receives sympathetic nerve fibers from the celiac and inferior mesenteric ganglia. Okay, remember your fight or flight response, your parasympathetic and your sympathetic. Okay. So the nerve innervation regulates renal blood flow and pressure, stimulates renin release. Renin controls your blood pressure, and it stimulates water and sodium reabsorption. So you do not dehydrate, okay, and you maintain your ion balance. Okay. So these nephrons, okay, they filter waste. This is your glomerular filtrate. This material leaves the glomerular capillaries and enters into what's called your glomerular capsule. This is where you filter everything. It enters into the glomerular capsule first. Then from this capsule, it feeds into what's called the proximal convoluted tubule. Then it goes through a nephron loop. So here's your glomerular capsule. It feeds into this convoluted proximal convoluted tubule. Then it goes down here through a loop, feeds into a distal convoluted tubule, and back into the minor calyx, the major calyx, the renal pelvis, into the urethra. Okay. So here's your glomerular filtrate. This is your glomerulus right here. This is your filtration unit. Okay, this is afferent blood coming in. This is efferent blood going out. And part of this blood gets filtered right here. Okay. As it filters from the glomerulus, it goes through the proximal convoluted tubule. It goes through the loop. Then it goes through the distal convoluted tubule and then out. Okay. Podocytes are specialized cells that make up the kidney. Okay. And this glomerulus has a capsule surrounding called the glomerulus capsule. Okay. Okay, these are two different types of nephrons. This is a cortical nephron, and this is a juxtamedullary nephron. You have to know those two different types. So here's your glomerulus. And again, the glomerulus feeds into the proximal convoluted tubule, goes through a loop, then it goes into the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, then it goes into the minor calyx, the major calyx, the renal pelvis, and out the ureter. Okay, so the two types of nephrons. The cortical nephron stays mostly in the cortex. Here's the cortex. Here's your medulla. Okay, so the cortical nephrons are short and they stay mostly in the cortex. Your juxtamedullary nephrons are extremely long and feed from the cortex into the medulla. Okay, so that's the difference. Cortical nephrons stay mostly in the cortex. Juxtamedullary nephrons, their big loop extends into the medulla. Okay, so the filtrate enters the distal convoluted tubule. Remember, it feeds from the glomerulus capsule into the proximal convoluted tubule, runs through the nephron loop, and comes to the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, they collect in what's called a collecting duct after it goes through the distal convoluted tubules, because all the filtration is going to occur in the ascending and descending loops of those nephrons. Okay, so the collecting ducts now go through the renal pyramids, then it enters the papillary duct, minor calyx, major calyx, goes into the renal pelvis, then it goes into the ureter, urinary bladder, then urethra. Okay, that's the flow of urine. Okay, here's your nephron loop. Again, you have afferent arterioles and efferent arterioles going in and out. This is your glomerulus. Your glomerulus is capsule. The filtration enters the proximal convoluted tubule. Then it has a descending loop, an ascending loop, and a distal convoluted tubule, which enters into collecting tubules, into collecting duct, feeds into the minor calyx, the major calyx, the pelvic, the renal pelvis, and then into the ureters. Okay, that's the basic flow rate of how it goes through. And you have cortical nephrons and you have juxtamedullary nephrons. Okay, so here's your cortical nephrons. Those are the ones that stay mostly in the cortex. They're relatively short. 85% of nephrons are cortical nephrons, where most of the nephron is located in the cortex. They have a relatively short nephron loop. Okay, 15% are juxtamedullary. They extend down deep in the nephron. That makes about 15% of them. The capsule is located near the border of the cortex and medulla, and they have a long nephron loop extending into the medulla of the kidney. Okay, so know the difference between cortical nephrons and juxtamedullary nephrons. Okay, and you can see this is your cortical nephron. This is your juxtamedullary nephron. Okay, you can see the difference on how they extend, and they're the same basic structures. They both have proximal convoluted tubules. They both have ascending loops. They both have descending loops. They both have distal convoluted tubules, and they feed into collecting tubules. So the same function, just one's a lot longer and feeds a lot deeper into the medulla than the other one. Okay. So the main function of the nephron, it resorbs useful organic material from the filtrate, and it processes urine. Okay, that's the main function of the nephron, to process urine. It resorbs more than 80% of the water from urine. Okay, that prevents dehydration of the body. Secretes waste into the filtrate that was missing in the earlier process. So the big thing is urine processing. Okay. So it reabsorbs more than 80% of the water that's gone in through it. This is your corpuscle. The renal corpuscle consists of your glomerular capsule and your glomerulus. Those are the capillaries inside of it. The glomerular capsule has two layers, a parietal layer and a visceral layer. Okay. Remember, the parietal layer is the outer layer, the visceral layer is the inner layer. It's like taking a balloon and punching your fist in the balloon. The layer touching has two layers in. The layer touching your fist is the visceral layer. The layer outside is your parietal layer. So parietal layer is squamous cells, continues with the lining of the proximal convoluted tubule, and folds back to form the visceral layer. The visceral layer makes up the endothelial lining of the capillaries. So here's your capsule. This is the parietal epithelium. This is the visceral epithelium. Okay, it's just like the lining of the balloon. This is where it feeds into the proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, so here's your glomerulus, and it filters blood into that. This is your afferent blood coming in, blood coming out, and some of this blood runs through this filter system here. It feeds in the proximal convoluted tubules. This runs through your loop, and then feeds into the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, this shows you the size, like the red blood cells going through these, so it can absorb. It's a very, very small, very, very small, so things can be absorbed and secreted back across the lining. This is what a glomerulus looks like, a scanning electron microscope. This is how the blood vessels wrap around the glomerulus capsules, and blood is filtered in through these into the proximal convoluted tubule from these glomerulus, from the glomerulus. Okay, you can see the glomerular capillaries, very thin capillaries, as they expand around the podocytes, which are your renal cells. Okay, so your renal corpuscles, your glomerular corpuscles here. Their filtration within the renal corpuscles, they have three different layers. Okay, we have the capillary endothelium, we have the basal lamina that supports it, then you have the glomerular epithelium that actually forms the filtration where the urine goes across and we filter out the different substances from it. Okay, so filtration within the renal corpuscles, the capillary endothelium. Glomerular capillaries are fenestrated. Fenestrated means what? Fenestrated means it has small holes. They're not continuous. So a fenestrated capillary is one that has holes or spaces or gaps. The openings are about 0.06 to 0.01 microns. Okay, that's too small for a red blood cell to pass through. We don't bleed into them. Okay, but the plasma can go through there and filter. The red blood cells cannot fit through because they're too large. Red blood cells are about 6 or 7 microns. So they're much too large to fit through the fenestrated openings of 0.1 micron. Okay, the basal lamina. This surrounds your capillary endothelium, it provides a support. Okay, it's a dense layer that restricts passage of large proteins, but permits smaller proteins to be excreted from the urine. So it permits the passage of ions and nutrients back into the body. Okay, the glomerular epithelium, okay, the lining of the glomerular capsules consists of special cells called podocytes. Okay, those are kidney cells. They're called your podocytes. They have long cellular extensions that wrap around the basal lamina. These extensions have gaps called filtration slits. Okay, they allow things to be filtered out. The filtrates passing along through consists of water, ions, small organic molecules, glucose, fatty acids, amino acids, and vitamins. Okay, that allows you to absorb all that back into the body. So the filtrate passing through these contains very few plasma proteins. Okay, so any potential useful products are reabsorbed back in the proximal convoluted tubules. So we reabsorb all the stuff that the body needs. Okay, so the first part is your proximal convoluted tubule that's lined with cuboidal epithelium, and it reabsorbs all your organic nutrients, reabsorbs all your plasma proteins. 60% of sodium chloride and water is reabsorbed. Salt and water go together. When osmotic pressure, you absorb salt, water gets pulled with it to keep the concentrations equal. Okay, it also reabsorbs calcium, potassium, magnesium, bicarbonate, phosphate, and sulfate. Okay, all those ions that we use as building blocks in ATP, in our amino acids. Okay, it reabsorbs all that in the proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, so here's your glomerular filtrate. This is the proximal convoluted tubule. That's the first section that it goes through. Okay, if the cortical nephron, this loop stays in the cortex, most of it. Okay, it's a juxtamedullary nephron. It extends deep down into the medulla. Right. After it goes through the proximal convoluted tubule, it goes down the descending portion of the loop. Okay, water leaves this portion and enters the bloodstream, preventing dehydration. Capillaries surround the nephron loop are called the vasa recta capillaries. So the water leaves it, water leaves the urine gets concentrated. So the water leaves it, okay, enters your bloodstream, so the urine gets concentrated and the body prevents it from being dehydrated. After it goes from the descending loop, it goes to the ascending loop. Okay, in the ascending loop, it pumps ions, sodium and chloride ions, out of the ascending loop, preventing the loss of these ions. Okay, and it's impermeable to water, so it only pumps those ions out. So the ascending loop pumps out the sodium and chlorine ions, but cannot pump out the water. It's impermeable to water as it ascends, as it comes back up. Okay, so here's your descending loop, and here's your ascending loop before it gets to the distal convoluted tubule. And this one is impermeable to water. It pumps out your ions, but does not pump out water. Okay, then we have the distal convoluted tubule. Okay. The distal convoluted tubule secretes ions and acids. Okay. There's selective resorption of sodium and calcium ions. There's very little resorption of water. Okay. Most of the water has been resorbed by the proximal convoluted tubule before it enters the loop. Most of the urine has been concentrated to that point. Okay. So again, this is where most of your water reabsorption occurs in proximal convoluted tubule. Then you have your descending loop, your ascending loop, which is impermeable to water. Cannot go through there. Then you have your distal convoluted tubule. Okay. Feeds into your collecting duct, tubules, collecting ducts. into your minor calyx, your major calyx, your renal pelvic, and then into the ureters, which goes towards the urinary bladder. Okay, juxtamedullary complex. I'm sorry, juxtaglomerular complex, not juxtamedullary. Juxtamedullary is a nephron. Juxtaglomerular complex is also called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Okay, it's located in the regions of the vascular poles. They consist of the macula densa cells, the juxtaglomerular cells, and the mesenglial cells. They produce two hormones in that part of the juxtaglomerular complex. They produce renin, which is involved in regulating your blood pressure, and erythropoietin, which is involved in producing red blood cells. Okay, so two hormones are actually produced in the juxtaglomerular complex. Renin for blood pressure, erythropoietin for the production of red blood cells. Okay. And here's your juxtaglomerular complex. Okay, it sits right here. This is your macula densa, which are the cells that line it, the extraglomerular mesangial cells, which support it out here, and your juxtaglomerular cells, which support the lining. Okay, those are your three layers of it, of the juxtaglomerular complex. All right, once it leaves the nephrons, it goes into the collecting system. Okay, it goes through the distal convoluted tubule, and then it enters from the distal convoluted tubule, it enters these connecting tubules, which feed into collecting ducts, which feed into papillary ducts. So the distal convoluted tubules of several nephrons get together and drain into the collecting ducts. The cells of collecting ducts make final adjustments to the concentration of the urine, and then it's about to exit the kidneys and go to the ureter into the urinary bladder. So the final corrections are being made in the collecting ducts. This is your collecting tubules, collecting ducts. Okay, variable resorption of water, resorption of secretion of sodium, potassium, hydrogen, bicarbonate. Okay, all the last minute adjustments are made to the urine before it goes into the minor minor calyx to the urethra, the ureters. Okay, so once it goes through that, it goes to the ureters. Ureters exit the kidney at the hilum area. Remember, that's where your renal blood supply, your arteries and veins come in and out. It's also where the ureters form and exit, and extends. These ureters extend to the urinary bladder. They enter the urinary bladder on the posterior inferior side of the urinary bladder. Okay, ureteral openings enter the urinary bladder in what's called the trigon area. Trigon area is a section of the urinary bladder. Okay.
Want a taco?
A little bit, yeah.
I'm gonna go get tacos.
A burrito, combination burrito. There goes my dog. All right, so here's the ureter. This comes from the kidneys here. Okay, this comes from the kidney on the other side. This is the trigon area. This little triangle right there. You can see where the left ureter enters and the right ureter enters. Okay. And that's how the urinary bladder is filled. It fills what's called from behind it and feeds inferior from it. So it comes from the back of it and it feeds in the inferior section. Okay. And then it allows it to fill into the urinary bladder. Okay. Each ureter consists of 3 layers as it travels from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. So the ureters have an inner mucosa. They have a middle muscular layer consisting of longitudinal circular muscles, and they have an adventita that continues with your fibrous capsule of the glomerulus. Okay, so here's the kidneys, adrenal glands, and it flows through the ureter into the urinary bladder. Okay, and this is a light microscope picture of the ureter. It has a mucosa, like I said, mucosa layer around it, smooth muscle, and its outer connective tissue layer, adventita. The urinary bladder, males and females. Okay, in males, the base of the urinary bladder is between the rectum and the symphysis pubis. In females, the base of the urinary bladder is inferior to the uterus and anterior to the vagina. Okay, so it sits differently in females because of the childbearing modifications that the body has gone through to allow for childbirth. So the urinary bladder is positioned a little differently. That's why in pregnant females, there's a greater tendency to urinate because the urinary bladder sits inferior to the uterus, which means as the uterus grows, it puts pressure on the urinary bladder and it causes it to feel like it's full more often. Okay. This is in the male. So here's the rectum. Okay. Here's a urinary bladder. Okay. This is the ureter coming out into it. Okay. And it feeds down through the urethra. Okay. We'll go through all the different sections in just a second. Okay. You see the location of the urinary bladder in the male, and in the female, you see the urinary bladder right here. There's your urinary bladder. So you can see this is where this is the uterus. As this baby grows, what's going to happen? That pressure is going to go against that urinary bladder, and it's going to flatten it out. And they're going to need to urinate a whole lot more often. Okay, just because the pressure, the more the baby grows, the more pressure gets put on that urinary bladder. Okay. Now, once it's in the urinary bladder, ureters drain it. Remember, the posterior and inferior drain into it. There are peritoneal folds that maintain the position of the urinary bladder. You have a median umbilical ligament and you have a lateral umbilical ligament. Okay. The median umbilical ligament extends from the anterior superior border of the umbilical region. The lateral umbilical ligament extends from the lateral edges to the umbilical region. Okay. So this is the median umbilicus ligament. Okay. And this is your lateral umbilicus ligament. Okay. That helps anchor the urinary bladder in place through those two ligaments, medially and then laterally on both sides. Okay. The layer of the urinary bladder is also called the dextrose muscle. That's the muscular layer of the urinary bladder. Okay. At the exit of the urinary bladder and entrance to the urethra is a smooth muscle that makes up the internal urethral sphincter. The internal urethral sphincter, just like the internal anal sphincter, is under involuntary control. You do not control it. Okay, it opens up when there's enough pressure and it starts to open. That's your internal urethral sphincter. Okay, so here's the dextrosor muscle. This surrounds the urinary bladder. That's a smooth muscle surrounding it. And here is your internal urethral sphincter. Here's a muscle that keeps closed. And there is no voluntary control. It's an involuntary muscle over the internal urethral sphincter. Okay. Now the urethra is a lot different in males and females. Okay. In females, the urethra is about 3 to 5 centimeters long. The external urethral orifice that you control is near the anterior wall of the vagina. In the male, the urethra is 18 to 20 centimeters long. Okay, 4 times the length. Okay, and is subdivided. We have a prostatic urethra, a membranous urethra, and a spongy urethra. Females only have a urethra. Males have a prostatic urethra, a membranous urethra, and a spongy urethra. So there's 3 different divisions of the urethra in the males. There's only 1 urethra in females. Okay, and it's at least 4 times longer in males than females. So in the male, the divisions of the urethra, when it passes through the prostate gland, it's called the prostatic urethra. There's a short segment that goes through the urogenital diaphragm. That's your membranous urethra. And the spongy urethra is once through the penis and then goes through the external urethral orifice. Okay, so here's the male. Here's your urinary bladder. Okay, here's the urethra coming out of it. Okay, so this is your urethra. Okay, as it passes through the prostate gland, that's your prostatic urethra. As it goes through this muscular layer right here, this intramembranous, that's your membranous urethra. Once it passes that, it runs through the penis to the external opening. That is your spongy urethra. Okay, so you have a prostatic urethra, a membranous urethra, and a spongy urethra. Okay, so the prostatic urethra runs through the prostate. The spongy urethra runs through the urogenital diaphragm. The spongy urethra runs through the penis. Those are 3 divisions. Okay, female, you have a urethra. That's it. Much easier. Just one line. Okay. You have your urethra feeds up into the urinary bladder. Okay. There's no divisions in the female. Okay. So as the urethra passes through your urogenital diaphragm, there's a skeletal muscle that makes up the external urethral sphincter. This one is under voluntary control. We control the external urethral sphincter. We do not control the internal. And we learn to control that as an infant. You lose control as you age, and you lose control due to some spinal cord injuries. Okay, so this is the external urethral sphincter located in just at the membranous urethra, right, the interosseous muscle there. Okay, that's your external urethral sphincter. The micturition reflex, the first urge to urinate is when your bladder fills about 200 milliliters. Okay, that's it, your first urge to urinate. Voluntary effort is needed to relax and open the external urethral sphincter. So you have to relax to open it. Okay, it takes an effort to do that. When the urinary bladder nears capacity, both urethral sphincters will open based on pressure. Upon complete void, you still have about 10 milliliters of urine that still remains. They'll do ultrasounds all the time to see what kind of retention your urinary bladder has. After you done urinate, it should have roughly 10 milliliters of urine left. It'll never void completely, but it should have not more than 10, or roughly around 10. Age-related problems. Okay, everything gets messed up with age. It's all downhill after 21. All right, so nephrons decrease in number, so you cannot filter as much as you used to. So your glomerular filtration rate declines. So there's reduced sensitivity to antidiuretic hormone, which results in frequent urination. You urinate more often as you get older. And you have micturition problems. Ejection of urine from the urinary bladder through the urethra is micturition, and sometimes it gets hard to control that as you age. Nephrons decline by about 30 to 40%. Micturition problems as the urethral sphincter loses muscle tone that leads to incontinence. The ability to control micturition due to stroke, Alzheimer's, etc., can cause that problem, or urinary retention can lead to infections if you can't void all your urine. That urine stores there in the stores, and that leads to infections. When you get an enlarged prostate, that also reduces your urine flow.